global privacy control versus do not track for your browsers and whether or not you should use them, whether or not you should use Google Sites, compatibility on Android operating systems, and also phone location privacy. Welcome to SR 192 Q&A, where we answer questions from our patrons who are supporting this podcast and keeping it free for all of you. And then we also showcase their questions and answer them on the show. The first one is from Tom, who asks, what do you know about global privacy control? Are there any other similar services? Are they effective? Do they make your browser easier to fingerprint? Are there any other privacy concerns? So back in the day, there was Do Not Track, DNT. And the cool thing about DNT is that it was kind of the first iteration of this where we saw that you can just signal to websites you don't want to be tracked, and then websites will just not track you. The problem with DNT is that there was no enforceability. It was up to websites whether or not they even wanted to take this seriously. And many websites don't even support the technologies to simply opt you out. So it was pretty much not only not enforceable, but it also actually introduced some fingerprinting concerns and made it easier to track some users, ironically, because not that many people even enabled Do Not Track. GPC is the new version of this, where essentially, same thing, you pretty much ping when you go to websites, you have a signal and it tells them, hey, I want to opt out of data tracking. The differences that I'm aware of with GPC is one, it's not just tracking on the website, but it's also the sale and sharing of personal information. So it's actually a little bit more extensive in the signal that's sent out and what it's signaling to websites you want. The second thing is enforcement. It's just slightly more aligned with privacy regulation like the CCPA and the GDPR. So sites are more likely to respect GPC. And it's also just a better technology. It's kind of an upgraded version of DNT. So even browsers like Brave and other privacy organizations have at least somewhat embraced GPC. What I don't know, and I'd like to do more research on, is if there are still fingerprinting concerns with GPC. I have to imagine there are, just because if you use a tool like privacytests.org, it can recognize whether or not you're using GPC. And in a lot of these situations, just knowing whether or not you have something on or off is the concern. But ideally, if more and more people are using GPC, then it's a less fingerprintable metric for users. So it's kind of up to you what you want to do. I use Brave a lot of the times, and I believe Brave implements this by default, if I'm not mistaken. Though I don't know what Mulvad browser does. That's another browser I use. I think for people who listen to this podcast who are already privacy savvy, this probably won't make a massive difference because you probably already use extensions that do certain things, or you turn off third-party cookies. You probably already do a lot of the things to prevent websites from doing this in the first place. I think technologies like this are more important for people who aren't going to do any of those things. And then they just want a way to just tell people, yeah, please don't track me. And maybe it works 80% of the times. That's the goal.
I've not heard of Web Choices, for the record. Tom asks about that specifically. GPC is the only one I've heard of. I would love to know, do organizations respect GPC? My money would be probably not. I would like to see some actual studies into this. Yeah, I think you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck using something like Tor browser, Mulvad browser, Brave browser, using uBlock origin, stuff like that.
And I just verified, I went to the website, globalprivacycontrol.org, and it does tell you whether or not it's picked up on a signal. Again, I don't know what kind of additional privacy implications just having this feature on it have, but yes, I just wanted to confirm that at least on Brave, I don't think I did anything crazy with my installation. This is something that's enabled.
Well, it looks like Mulvad browser does not support it.
One of our forum members from Techlore actually opened a GitHub issue for Mulvad browser for this. Pretty much they said, consider enabling global privacy control by default. It's not closed, but there's no comments yet from any Mulvad team members.
My official opinion is I don't think this works. I don't think this does anything, because if you look here on their website, turn on GPC, send the signal, and then step 3, exercise your rights. Participating websites can, emphasis mine, respect your privacy rights accordingly, which means 3 websites on the internet that nobody visits.
I want to reiterate, though, that there are different legal implications for GPC over DNT. So even if it's not foolproof, it's still stronger, and it seems like it's better thought out than DNT was. So I'd see this as more of like an improved DNT V2 kind of situation.
I did actually just see that. If I scroll down a little bit, it says, now you can exercise your legal privacy rights in one step via GPC, required under the California Consumer Protection Act. So if you live in California, sure, this is a great thing to try. Or if your VPN is in California, for everyone else, go kick rocks. I don't know. I'm cynical. Our next question is a two-parter, and it comes from Gunnar. So part one, you say you've been using Calyx OS for about a month. It works quite good. Sadly, you also have to use a normal phone. You didn't specify which OS because some apps do not work as intended. These are essential apps. I need to use them. For now, it's okay to carry two phones, but question number one, I need to be able to use these apps in a better way than two phones. I recently read that you can dual boot Calyx. Do you know if it's possible, or do you have another recommendation? I would direct that question to the Calyx team, because as far as I know, that's not possible. Or if it is possible, it's probably like a kind of janky workaround. But I wanted to include this first question just in case anybody in the comments has any suggestions, or if maybe Henry knows anything.
No, I've never heard of dual booting, and I just looked it up and nothing's coming up. There are other ROMs that have different approaches to app compatibility that you may want to consider. I think having like two phones just because you can't get all your apps to work on one device kind of sucks. And so if you can find a better solution to that, that'd be really ideal. Plexus is a project that we work on over at Techlore. You can see compatibility of things before you move to something that utilizes microG specifically.
And then second question, I'm planning to migrate from Windows to Linux. For now, I also need to have a Windows environment for certain programs. Have not found anything similar on Linux. I cannot dual boot. I will need to run both at the same time. I was thinking about using a Windows in a virtual machine on my Linux host, but some people have been saying that Windows in a VM can see everything on Linux. Is that accurate? Again, someone correct me if I'm wrong. That sounds completely insane to me, because the whole point of a virtual machines are really more of a security thing than a privacy thing, to my knowledge, because the whole point is everything's supposed to be contained in that VM. As with anything, there are vulnerabilities. Sometimes things can break out of the VM, but they're not supposed to. So again, like, someone in the comments, let me know if I'm wrong, but I've never heard that before. And to me, that sounds like just some FUD.
Just a few things. Like, again, there are features with virtual machine software that you can like share your keyboard, you can share files. If you have stuff like that set up, then obviously anything that's shareable between the two, you should assume that they can see what they're doing. But yeah, like Nate said, assuming nothing's horribly wrong, no. By default, the answer is no. The guest can't see what's going on in the host, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. There's always vulnerabilities that can exist. There are some pieces of malware that have been able to escape a virtual machine. So anything's possible, but to say that that's just how it is and that Windows can just see everything on your host is really like a leap of faith. That's just not really how it works.
I just wanted to throw those at the community. As far as I know, no way to dual boot. Guests should not be able to see the host, but if anybody knows otherwise, please leave it in the comments.
Next question is from Mark Pinter. They said they have a couple of pages on a website that they use professionally. It's currently on Google Sites, linked to a custom domain, but they are removing Google from the rest of their life. The reasoning is that Google will be able to see the web page anyway, so there's no difference in just keeping the website there. But this thinking doesn't sit well with them. What are your thoughts? Is there another simple alternative where they can construct a simple HTML site, but it's more privacy respecting? Is there actually a good reason to switch other than my Google allergy? Actually, if it's a public website and you essentially have the information that you're sharing with Google, if it's just tied to the public website and it's not tied to you, I think from a privacy perspective, it's going to be a similar situation with most other hosting providers and services. Google might be more likely to, tie the data to other Google information, but again, it's public info, it's your website. With that said, if you do have a Google allergy, you don't want to give Google your business, I think that's actually a much more valid reason to possibly find something else. So it's kind of your call, personal preference. If you want to support Google and keep relying on Google, I will say there probably are some benefits. I wouldn't be surprised if a site built on Google might have SEO benefits just because, Google does the search. Google also can help optimize your own site. Also, I just feel like in general, as a business, having access to some kind of business Google account at any point becomes nice. If you ever want to set up like SEO things on Google for like their search console, or if you ever have to have a YouTube account down the road, or if you ever want to use Gmail for your business, I'm not saying you have to use these things, nor do you have to use them to be a successful business, but I just know a lot of people, even Google Voice, for example, is a common thing that a lot of businesses use. So Just some things to think about.
When you say constructing a simple HTML site, I mean, are you talking about something that builds the site for you, or are you talking about you made your own files? Because in my experience, if it's something like Wix or Squarespace that makes the site for you, there's always going to be some analytics built in regardless that you don't really have control over. But if you're just talking about like, I have the HTML files and I just want to dump them somewhere, I mean, there are alternatives for sure, but they're also probably going to be a little more expensive because now you're looking at like a VPS and stuff like that, or cPanel, which again comes with analytics you can't control. I think Henry really hit the nail on the head. If you're talking about publicly available information and all you use that Google account for is that website, I think the risk is relatively limited. But also, I mean, if you can afford it, I think that's the issue with business and privacy is, unpopular opinion, businesses are there to make money. And if you can't justify the cost of something, you can't justify it. So like, if your business doesn't bring in enough money for you to justify switching to one of these more privacy friendly options, then it doesn't make sense. And technically, objectively speaking, you shouldn't do it. But if you're making enough money that you're like, well, it'll cost a little more, but it'll align with my values and it'll make me sleep a little better at night, but you can still like pay for it, then yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfectly valid reason to do it, to be in line with your values. And our last question comes from David Johnson. How do you guys approach phone location privacy? So of course, there is the actual location setting in the phone settings and apps and stuff. You can turn that on and off, but that doesn't account for things like the carrier. You know, the carrier needs to know where you are in order to connect you to a cell tower, provide service, ideally optimize which one you're connected to. And then of course, there's side channel attacks that are known to collect location through neither of those things. So according to David Johnson, you say, it seems to me that the subject of user phone location control is sort of a red herring, hair splitting over mostly inconsequential technological minutia at the cost of providing meaningful control over the ultimate outcome of location confidentiality. What is your opinion on the state of affairs in this field, and how do you approach your location privacy? This is a perfect example of one of those privacy things where like you could really run yourself ragged. I was doing the whole thing where like I used a de-Googled phone with like a hotspot, so I didn't have a SIM card. Even then, my phone is still pinging cell towers in case I need to make an emergency call. But then it's one of those things like, so am I just not going to carry a phone? Am I only going to take it out of the Faraday cage once an hour when I need to, you know, check for messages? Like, and that's not reasonable for the record. Like, I'm not in a position where I can afford to do that. I think it is definitely one of those things of how deep down the rabbit hole do you want to go? Some people don't need to carry a phone. Good for you. We're all happy for you. Most people can't do that. I wouldn't say it's a red herring or hair splitting. I think it's just one of those things that's worth being aware of and just threat modeling and doing the things that fit your threat model.
I feel like for a lot of people, this is a situation where they're going to be maybe stepping over $1 to pick up a penny. Oh, hey, oh, wow, they can triangulate this for my home, blah, blah, blah. But most people aren't dealing with that. Most people just need to disable a location permission for apps that don't need it, that are proven to actually use that data for nefarious purposes. Not that cell companies haven't also been proven to collect this data and sell it, and there's been very similar things happen with them. But one of them is much more direct, one of them is much more easy to deal with, and one of them is much more frequent. And it's actually reasonable to deal with the problem. One thing I actually take a little bit of issue with is the whole concept of, you know, turning off your phone before you go home. Because people say, well, I don't want my home to be triangulated. If your location all day, every day is being tracked and then you just disappear in a quarter-mile window for 12 hours every day, I don't think it's that hard to figure out where you are. That's what I have to say to that. I think for most of you listening, start with the basics, which for me are disabling location permission, and then also for websites or apps that might try to get your location from your IP address. When it comes to cell carriers, I just don't think there's any like reasonable advice I can give that is actually proven to work outside of just not using a SIM card at all. That's really your only option, I feel, to deal with those. We had some really good questions this week. We talked about global privacy control, do not track. We talked about compatibility on some operating systems, dual booting / VMs. We talked about hosting websites and if Google Sites works for you. We talked about phone location privacy. Pretty big week. And we got a little bit more technical this week, so hopefully it wasn't too long and hopefully we didn't bore any of you. Again, these questions come from people who support this podcast, which can be you as well. We already have the next Q&A up and running, so if you want to ask a question right now, link's already down on Patreon. So just join Patreon and you'll be able to ask a question right away. See you next week.